Thanks, good morning. I've got this lavalier microphone. I guess it's working. Looks okay, so I don't have to stand still if I don't want to. I always hate it when I get a good introduction, like, oh, he's got a good sense of humor, he's gonna be exciting. Well, I'd rather have be told, well, just, plow through this, it's only an hour and a half, and then low expectations, I can do better than you expect. But it is good that I get to go after the guy from the Attorney General's office, at least. That helps a little bit. So my name is Jason Gramitt. I'm a staff attorney at the Rhode Island Ethics Commission, and my part of the program today is really to just orient you to this idea of there being an ethics commission in Rhode Island, letting you know what that means, how you fit into the ethical administration of government in the state, how the Code of Ethics applies to you primarily. The Code of Ethics is a long document. There are many provisions of the code. This is a copy of the code. It's got something like 56 pages of provisions. I'm not going to cover all 56 pages. Today we're only going to talk about a few sections of the Code of Ethics that I think apply to you. Primarily, these are things about having you identify conflicts of interest and understanding what a conflict of interest is and feeling comfortable with the idea of admitting that you have conflicts of interest. Because it's not a problem to have conflicts, we all do. The question is, what do you do with them? How do you manage them properly? So we're going to talk about how to know when you've got a conflict of interest and then what to do about it. What's the recusal process and how to do it the right way and how to do it the wrong way also. That's the primary thing we'll talk about today. I'll start out by talking about a little bit of just the history of the Ethics Commission. We just had a historic ballot question on that hopefully you all voted yes for. At least 80% of you voted yes for, from what I understand. So 280,000, 300,000 people voted yes on question 2, and I'll explain a little bit about what that meant. Although it doesn't change things for you too much, it changes things for some other elected officials pretty significantly. We'll also talk about the gift rules. There are some gift rules that apply to elected officials and appointed officials, like any superintendents in the room, but they also apply to any school department employees. So these rules that I'm going to talk about today, these ethics rules, they don't just apply to elected or in some cases appointed school committee members, but they apply to all state and municipal elected officials, appointed officials, and employees. So all of your teachers are subject to these same rules that I'll be talking about today. I'm a state employee, so I'm subject to all of these rules. I'll talk a little bit about revolving door, and I'll talk about what that means, what the revolving door means for a school committee member in municipal government. And I'll talk a bit about financial disclosure, but I won't talk a lot about financial disclosure. And all of that I'll do in the hour and 25 minutes or so that we have left. Along the way, I noticed that there are 2 microphones in the audience, and so what I would like to do is, rather than holding all the questions for the end when 95% of you hope that no one stands up and asks questions so that you all can leave, right? I've been there. Oh, no, not another question. Instead, how about if when you have a question, just come on up to a microphone and we'll just go right into it at that point. If we're talking about recusal and you have a question, come and ask a question about recusal. And if we're talking about gifts, come and ask a question about gifts. If we're talking about the Ethics Commission and you have a comment or a question, let's just get right into it right then. I've been asked to ask you to please use the microphones rather than do it from your seat because we're being videotaped and we want to make sure that your excellent questions make it to the tape. So with that said, let's begin. By the way, I don't use a whole lot of PowerPoint, so and that's the only sound you're going to hear. That's it. So mostly I'll be talking, and I use these slides just to kind of help focus the discussion a little bit. Let's begin by talking a little bit about what the Ethics Commission is and how it might even apply to you. How did we get an Ethics Commission? Tim was talking about the Constitution, and about how important it is to education. Well, in Rhode Island, the Constitution is really important to ethics and ethics enforcement, because the State Ethics Commission is different than any other administrative agency in the state that you're used to dealing with. Most administrative agencies are created by statute, by the General Assembly. They pass enabling legislation, and they lay out the rules that the agency has to enforce and follow. And then the agency can make some regulations that, as long as they're consistent with those enabling statutes, everything is fine. But the Ethics Commission is different. It was created in 1986 by an amendment to the state constitution. So in the years leading up to the 1986 Constitutional Convention, there were widespread, very public examples of cronyism and nepotism in the state. Can you believe it? In the state of Rhode Island. And you know, if you know people from outside of Rhode Island and you ask them, hey, what do you know about Rhode Island? First they say, isn't that part of New York? No. Then they talk about corruption. Maybe they mention Buddy Cianci. Maybe they mention these types of issues. But around that time, Rhode Island had a really horrible reputation, and so much so that the voters decided to amend the Constitution to create this independent, nonpartisan ethics commission that would have the ability not only to enforce some ethics rules, but to write them, to create them itself. So today we have an ethics commission that creates a code of ethics that applies to everyone I mentioned before. We enforce those rules. We also enforce and administer annual financial disclosure of public officials. We do education like this, and we issue a lot of advice. Advice is what takes up most of our time at the Ethics Commission. We issue advisory opinions, and we answer the phone when you call us and ask us questions. And I'll give you some information about how to do both of those things before I'm done today. So let's just take a quick look. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the constitutional part, but this was the first part of the Constitution that was amended. So if you open up the Rhode Island Constitution today, you'll find this under the Ethics Amendment. And really, this slide is what says it all. I mean, if everybody could just memorize this, and I find it important enough that it's what I have printed on the back of my business cards, by the way. So that's how important I think this language is. The people of the state of Rhode Island believe that public officials, like you, and employees must adhere to the highest standards of ethical conduct, respect the public trust and the rights of all persons, be open, accountable, and responsive, avoid the appearance of impropriety, and not use their position for private gain or advantage. The first thing I want to just mention, this has nothing to do so much with ethics as it is just an interesting historical note. This clause here, respect the public trust and the rights of all persons, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, there was one delegate who really wanted to put kind of a non-discrimination clause into the Constitution somewhere, wanted to be clear that Rhode Island public officials shouldn't discriminate against anyone on the basis of race or religion or color or anything. And he was able to sneak in that clause right in the middle of the Ethics Amendment. So it's not something the Ethics Commission enforces. We do have a Commission for Human Rights that handles discrimination cases, but it's an interesting historical note that we have a non-discrimination clause in our Constitution that was kind of snuck under the radar. But other than that, I've all capped this highest standards of ethical conduct language because this is the first point I want to make. I have a few big points I want to make during my presentation today, and this is the first one. That you're supposed to hold yourself to the highest standards of ethical conduct. And I want you to understand that the Code of Ethics, these are not the highest standards of ethical conduct. This is the low bar, right? You break the law if you don't comply with this, but you can do a lot better than just not breaking the law. You can hold yourself to a much higher standard of ethical conduct than just not having to pay a fine because you've done something wrong. So that kind of dovetails into this avoiding the appearance of impropriety, which I'll come back to again in a minute. The people who wrote our Constitution, which is you, by the way, the public votes on the Constitution, not our legislators, not our governor. The people enact the Constitution. They not only wanted people to not have improprieties and not to do things that are unethical, but they're asking you, as elected officials, don't even do things that look wrong, because in Rhode Island, that can be just as bad. Doing things that cause people to write letters to the editor and that cause that gadfly in your town to always stand up and complain about the fact that you should be recusing and you have a conflict of interest, right? You all have them, right? Some better or worse than others. You're supposed to avoid even that appearance of impropriety. So we'll come back to that theme as we move on. And then this is just the nuts and bolts, which I'm not going to go into, in the Constitution, which lays out how we created the Ethics Commission and what its powers are. I will point out, though, just before we move on, that it does say all elected and appointed officials and employees of state and local government shall be subject to the Code of Ethics. That was the language that in 2009 the Supreme Court said that all elected officials doesn't include the General Assembly. So if you take out the General Assembly, all elected state officials means 5 people. The governor, lieutenant governor, general treasurer, you get the other ones, attorney general, and secretary of state. So what you did with passing question 2 is you sent some language back into the Constitution that clarified that when we said in 1986 all elected officials are subject to the Code of Ethics, 30 years later we still mean all. And you were able to reverse that 2009 decision of the Rhode Island Supreme Court. I see a question. Is there?
Why were they exempt from the General Assembly in the first place?
Why were they well, the question is, why was the General Assembly exempt from ethics enforcement? And they weren't for the first couple of decades. So from 1987 all the way through 2009, 22 years, the Ethics Commission did have jurisdiction over the members of the General Assembly. And we had cases against the General Assembly. We've had cases against Gordon Fox and John Salona and others whose names you would probably recognize. But in 2009, the court, on an appeal from a Senate president, ruled that they had some immunity in the Constitution and that the only way to fix it would be to clarify the language of the Constitution. So that's what happened. And thank you for doing that. In question 2, that becomes effective January 3rd.